Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 82 in the series. This one is a little bit about the history of knitting, and I think it might be the first of a few podcasts on the history of knitting, so we'll jump into that kind of thing as part of the cast as we go on. I'm coming to you from Urbana, Illinois, where it has been a little bit of a wild day. We had technical issues with the camera, so I lost, the first third of a podcast, no problem. And then I just came in here to sit down again after I charged up the camera, and my son called me and said, "Mom, I think there's a fox running around near the chickens." So I just went outside, and sure enough, there was a fox. I thought it would have run off, it's the middle of the day. It's not rabid, it did run away from us, but it was still hanging around in the woods, and I could follow it up into the woods a little bit, and I thought, time to shut the chicken run up a little bit. We also have some chicks out there in a tractor, and anyway, when I'm done casting, I'll be out back saving the chickens from whatever that fox has in store for the evening. Anyway, so welcome to the cast. For those of you who are new, I don't usually talk about foxes and chickens. This is usually a podcast about garment design and DIY and modifications, a little bit of spinning sometimes. And for those of you who are coming back, it's always lovely to see you. Thanks for coming back and hanging out with me. I'm coming to you from Urbana, Illinois, in a pandemic still. This is a pandemic podcast still. And I think it will be for quite some time. I hope you all are well. Doing okay, keeping sane, keeping busy. Those of you who don't know me, I guess I should tell you, I'm a professor at the university here. I teach science fiction, speculative fiction, science studies, all that good stuff. Spencer lovingly calls me Queen of the Nerds, and I appreciate that title, which is why I have my Queen of the Nerds t-shirt on. This is my All Hail the Mantis Shrimp t-shirt, and I just felt like today was the day to wear it, and that was before the camera troubles and the chickens, so it's kind of like empowering, and now I think I actually need it to go out back and deal with Mr. or Mrs. Fox. Yeah. So what are we going to do today? We're going to do a little bit of a work in progress. This is Hikari by Yamagara, and a little bit of knitting history. I have an update on the modification class and on Shorn 3, and I have the winners of the giveaway from last time. So maybe I'll jump in by talking about quick updates on the fleece and the modification class. So as some of you guys know who've been coming back for a while, I make my own yarn every year, or I have been for the last 2 years. This will be the third year running. It's called Shorn, and it is made up of fleece that I gather from local shepherdesses. And somehow I, maybe not so inadvertently, became a shepherdess myself this past last summer and then this summer. Kathy of Seven Sisters Farm often pastures her sheep here, and we've got 10 of them out there this year. They're all doing well, and that is the fleece that I used to make Shorn yarn, or I did last year and I will this year. So the Shorn yarn, the good news is I shipped it off, and I got a notice from the mill that they kind of charge me for the pre-processing stuff, so the yarn is almost, it maybe is underway, it's almost underway, it's in process, so that's good. And as I mentioned in a cast a while back, I'm going to be putting a call out for designers, because I'd love to have especially young designers, new designers, designers from the Black, Indigenous, people of color, any of those kinds of designers that maybe aren't as mainstream or aren't finding venues for your designs. I'd love to feature some of your work as part of the Shorn launch. So more details on that coming soon. The other thing is, a while back I mentioned that I'm working on a modification class this summer, and that is underway. I've got a syllabus written up, and I think it's going to take me the rest of the summer to film and edit everything and get it up on a platform. I haven't decided exactly how or where I want to do that yet, so that's also part of the process. But that modification class will be coming out, I think, in the fall. I'm also going to be putting together my science fiction class as an online class, so yeah, a lot of teaching, which is, it's kind of my bag, so I'm excited about that. And the modification class will take you through all the ways that you can and should or might want to modify garments. So it should be kind of fun, and I hope many of you will jump on board with that and let me know what you think. And if you have ideas or comments or questions, common things that things that come up for you as you're thinking about modifications, I'd love to know them, because they could possibly incorporate them into the class, with credit of course, and I would appreciate it. Yeah, if you're looking for a class right now online for fitting your knits, like how to take a pattern and make sure that your gauge and your fit is going to be better for your body, I can highly recommend Carol Feller's class called Masterclass. It's a masterclass called Fit Your Knits, and I signed up for it. This is not a promotion. It's not like she didn't send it to me. I signed up for it. I think when I signed up for it, it was about $27. And it's a really long and detailed class where she goes through fit on all kinds of different sweaters. She does a lot of top-down knitting and designing, but she's one of my favorite designers. Her class is excellent, and I think it's on the Teachable platform. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And if you're interested in checking out that class, or you're worried or thinking about garment design and fit right now, not necessarily modifications that I'm going to be doing in the other class, then that is up right now, and it's a great class to take. So I highly recommend it. All right. So, updates aside, I have a work in progress for you. This is the Hikari sweater by Yamagara, and Yamagara is actually the name that Bernice Lim uses for her designs up on Ravelry, and she's a designer from Singapore, and a lot of her, on her Ravelry page, she talks about wanting to design garments for kind of hot weather, and so she designs things in linen and cotton a lot. She has accessories, cardigans, sweaters, all kinds of different, like pullovers, all kinds of different things. So I'd check out her page. She does some really cool things with like catching your eye with a pattern and kind of drawing it into certain kinds of spaces, and you'll see that with this sweater as well, I think. So this sweater I'm actually knitting it in the yarn that was recommended. The yarn that's recommended is called Parade, and this pattern came out in Amirisu, the most recent issue of Amirisu, which is a Japanese knitting magazine, and it's the second sweater I'm knitting out of that issue, and I really love that issue. There's a lot of great sweaters in there. So Parade they call it a festive summer blend, and it's 60% wool, 20% cotton, 10% silk, and 10% linen. So you know that it's the kind of yarn that is going to give you a little bit of both properties. So a little bit of wool, which means it's going to have some elasticity, it's going to have some memory, it'll ease some of the problems they might have with tension. And pull out my swatch as I smash stuff. So oftentimes if you knit up, for those of you who knit with cotton or linen yarn, you might notice that your cotton or your linen yarn really shows off your mistakes in your tension, or the places in your tension that aren't perfect. But this yarn is actually pretty darn even and sweet, and that is that 60% wool content to the rescue, because it's filling in the gaps, it's kind of plumping up, it's doing all the right things. And this swatch was washed, so I think you can really, I know I'm holding it up for the third time, but I think you can really see how even it comes out. It comes out, wool is just one of those magical fibers that just fills in the spaces and does good things. So I knew once I knit up that swatch that this yarn was going to be the kind of yarn that was more forgiving than a 100% linen or cotton blend. Yeah, and this color is London, I think? Yeah, it's London. And it's this beautiful kind of, I think you can see it best back here. That's a pretty good representation of it. It's this beautiful kind of shimmery gray that I love very much, especially if I'm knitting something like this that's going to be kind of a wardrobe staple. Gray is kind of a nice neutral background color to be wearing to work and things like that. Now, the thing you might notice about this sweater, if you know about the Amirisu issue, is that it's not, it doesn't look like the Amirisu issue. And that's because the biggest modification I did is to take the front panel off this sweater. I kept the back panel, so you can see it here. This is a beautiful triangle of seed stitch and these through the back loop kind of twisted stitches that produce these beautiful lines. And the sweater was supposed to have the exact same triangle on the front. Well, I liked that when I first saw the pattern. It's what drew me to the pattern. But once I looked at the Ravelry project pages, I got a little bit gun shy on the whole thing, and here's why. A lot of the Ravelry project pages showed someone like this. You know, like, hey, look at the back of my sweater, it's beautiful. And I do have a mantis shrimp back there, in case you guys were wondering what's back there. So the Ravelry project pages, no one was showing off the front of their sweater. And I thought, you know, that's generally a kind of giveaway on Ravelry. If you see a bunch of projects and people are kind of like, you know the ones, they're standing weird, or they're like kind of holding the sweater up, or they're doing this, especially. You're like, someone didn't put short rows in the back. So once I saw the project pages not showing the front of the sweater, I thought, maybe there's something a little funny about having a triangle on the front of your sweater. And I started to think about it, and I thought, well, maybe it's kind of like horizontal lines. You know, there's like a kind of elongation that happens, or not elongation, a kind of widening that happens, and maybe having a triangle that gets wider and wider until it gets to your hips. Maybe for some of us, that's the widest part of our torso. Maybe that's not a flattering design feature for some. I don't know. So I decided, you know, I'm just gonna go plain on the front, plainish, and then keep the wow factor for the back. So what I did is I invented, given the number of stitches, I invented my own kind of cool design. I wanted it to be a broad band that wasn't too ribbed to kind of draw it in, but was just kind of a feature. And so I did this band that's basically like 3 knit stitches, purl stitch, and then a twisted back loop stitch. And that way I could keep my twisted stitch, the line of my twisted stitch, going all the way down through this part of the front. I also really like the fact that it does this swoop on the side. So the triangle comes down here, and it picks up this kind of rectangular, kind of flattened hemline toward the bottom. I kind of like that. I think it's flattering. I will say the mistake I made here is then, while I had that, I decided to go with the regular hem that is in the sweater pattern, and I ended up not liking it at all. So on the back it works great because you've got this cool seed stitch with the elongated lines produced by the twisted stitches, and they kind of feed into each other and you create more and more lines, and it's just really cool looking. But on the front it's like 2 ribbed patterns just fighting it out a little bit. So the job that is before me is to rip that out and start over again on this hem, and I think what I'll do is just continue the pattern that I have here just for another 1.5 inches. Now, all of this is to say, sometimes you modify as you go, which will be part of our class. That it's part of the syllabus. And modifying as you go can be, you know, a little bit risky and dangerous, because you might end up with something that you don't quite like and you have to rip back a little bit. But that's part of the fun, I think, too. So one other thing I discovered is that when I was trying to cast or bind off this hem, I didn't like the bind off that was called for in the pattern. It was making it splay, because it was what's called for is to bind off in pattern, which meant 2 purls and a twisted stitch. And if you knit in pattern, the nice thing about that is it produces a looser bind off, so that you're not, you know, if you have a regular wool sweater, that gives you more stretch, so that it's not like a rope at the bottom of your sweater. But the problem with that, when you're working with even a cotton linen blend that's 40% like this one, is that when you lose structure, you lose structure. Like when you lose discipline, the discipline of the yarn, you lose the structure of the pattern. So as I was binding off in pattern, even if I used a needle that was a size down, I was getting the splay. And so what that would produce is, like, when you were wearing it, it would fan out, and I didn't think that was gonna be very flattering. So I tried a bunch of different bind offs, actually. I ended up going with a bind off that using a needle that was 1 size smaller and doing a 2-stitch I-cord bind off. And I quite like the 2-stitch I-cord bind off because it's still a little bit flexible. It's low key, so it's not like a huge like piece of material around your waist or your hips, but it gives this bind off a lot of structure at the bottom without being too binding, and that means that it's gonna hold the rib and you're gonna be able to put it on, and it's just gonna function much more wearably than other bind offs. And I tried a bunch. I was sitting there binding off, taking it out, binding off, taking it out, just to see what would work with this yarn. I do think that this yarn and this pattern is going to produce a really flattering sweater, and you'll see that it was designed to be a short sleeve sweater. So it has a drop shoulder, which you can see here. So this was intended to be basically the end of the sleeve where my fingers are lined up. So you'd pick up stitches and you do a quick maneuver, end it with a little bit of flare, and then that's it. But what I'm doing is putting long sleeves on it because I do think this will be a nice, kind of like, what do you call those seasons? Shoulder seat, like fall, spring kind of sweater. I think it'll be warmish in the winter, but because of the wool content, but because of the linen cotton, I think it'll be nice and breathable as well. So I wanted to go with a long sleeve. You can see I've got my little markers in here for my decreases. I saw someone doing that on Instagram. They tagged me. I can't remember who it was. It was in a story, so I couldn't find it. But that's my little technique for keeping up with those decreases. And because you're starting well below the shoulder cap and the armhole, you're going to be picking up fewer stitches and you're going to be doing fewer decreases, because you're basically, instead of starting here with the sleeve, you're starting somewhere down here. So that's a big difference in terms of like the what do you call it, circumference of your arm at one point versus another, and how long you actually have to do the decreases. So those are two things to keep in mind there. One thing I want to say about this pattern is that it is a really, really cool design, and that's one of the reasons that I picked it out. You actually start with an I-cord. You begin here. Yeah, isn't that cool? You begin with this funky I-cord at the, not even at the shoulders, it's like above the shoulders, and then you use short row shaping to create this great shape for your back, like your shoulder blades. And then after that you're picking up stitches and creating the front. So it's just like half the time you don't even know where you are in the pattern, which makes it super interesting. And I love the way that this sits on the back, and it really, I've got a design in mind that would actually make really nice use of this to play with some color over the shoulders. So I think I might have to pull that out. It also has some really interesting design features in terms of this V-neck, which is, it's all seamless construction. It's not quite top down because you start with the I-cord, but it is top down. And you create your V-neck as you go along, so you don't even have to go back in for finishing later, which is pretty amazing. And then you have this really neat twisted stitch that runs down the front. Now normally the twisted stitch would run into that triangle, which is what you get on the back. If you had done that, the twisted stitch would have come like down here. But I think it's cool to just have a front panel like that with a little bit of interest, and then I want to go for this wide band at the bottom. Yeah, and this is what the armhole looks like if it's before you pick up stitches. So you can see it's drop shoulder, it's well below where your shoulder would be. So picking up less stitches, fewer stitches, and working down. So that's all that I have left on this sweater, except for ripping back. Not so happy about that. But anyway, it's been a real learning adventure on this sweater, and I think it might be the kind of sweater that would be good for talking about in that modification class that I'm going to be putting together. That kind of sweater is it's an interesting idea, and thinking about how to modify it is actually kind of tricky, because since it's top down and since you've got this triangle that you want to start in a particular place, there are only a few places you can modify for length and for your armholes and all kinds of other good tricky stuff that I'll probably talk about in the next cast, but I'll definitely talk about those principles in the modification class. So yay, that's the work in progress. And I quite like it. So again, it's the Hikari by Yamagara, who is Bernice Lim. Check out her patterns on Ravelry. I kind of want to, there's a cardigan on there that I really kind of want to knit next to, so we'll see. Okay, last little segment is a segment about knitting history. And I think this is going to become, what I'd like it to become is like an ongoing segment for a while, because I have some books I'm realizing I really want to read through and I want to talk to you guys about. What kind of sparked my thought about including some knitting history here is that we've done rare and hard to find books. We've done knits in translation, so knitting in other languages. So we've talked about a lot of books from tons of other languages, which were all really interesting. And Debbie, my good spinning knitting friend, a while back sent me this link to a dissertation And the dissertation was called A Taxonomy of Sweater Structures and Their Origins. And I was like, whoa. And I've been just waiting to have a free moment to go check it out. So I thought, well, this segment on the cast will be a great way to kind of dive into this stuff and make time for some of the things that I really want to read about and learn about. So this particular, it's not a dissertation, it was a master's final project for the program in textile management technology at NC State. And it was put together in 2002 by Gail Ann Lambert. And you might know Gail from Lambert Designs. She had a design company for quite some time. I think some of her patterns are still up on Ravelry, though I haven't quite finished my research into all of this. But this was her Master's of Science in Textile Management Technology project. And it goes through so many different sweater styles and the histories of them, and from all over the world. So all the way, I mean, I think she talks about Afghanistan and Ireland and definitely England and Scotland, and I want to say she talks about Germany. Anyway, it's all over the place, really great, and it's actually free and easy to get to, so I'll put a link to it in the show notes. If you want to check out her master's thesis project, you can too, but I plan on reading it, and it's full of design notes, charts, sweater sketches, and just it's amazing. So you have to check it out to see it to believe it. But she got me thinking. I was looking at the references, and I was looking at the permissions that she got to reproduce some of the images that she did, and I recognized some of the books. So I thought I'd run through a couple of the books here, and hopefully these will be some of the books that I can read, we can read together and talk about. So one of the first ones that I noticed that she included was called Poems of Color, which I was like, that sounds familiar. And I was like, oh yeah, I got that at an estate sale. So Poems of Color. This is Knitting in the Bauhaus Tradition by Wendy Keel, and the women who drove this Swedish cottage industry. So there's one really great history of knitting book. And one of the things she talks about in that master's thesis was the need to really go back to the history and like go back to these books and the people who actually know the traditions, because there's been a lot of mythos kind of around certain kinds of sweaters, and certain kinds of sweaters being from certain kinds of origins or not, and it turns out when you do the investigation and do the research and you look into the history, like there's actually a different story there, or a more nuanced story, or something else. So that was one of her main points, I think, in her kind of like discussion conclusion. So I thought, okay, we're going to go to the source, and we'll have a segment on here on lots of knitting history stuff. Another big one that she mentioned that I think is a great resource is called The History of Hand Knitting. And I started reading this maybe last summer, and I want to get through this one as well. Maybe we'll do a few history knitting lessons from here. There's also one called No Idle Hands, which I think I have on the other shelf, so that would be another one that we can look through and talk about. What else have I got? I have one on Arctic Lace by Donna Cronus, and this is about the Alaska's native knitters. And I think I started reading this one when I was investigating Kiviat, and I think this will be another interesting one. It has some patterns in it as well. There's also very specific books about like lace from Shetland. So this is Shetland Lace by Gladys Medro. And a lot of these books are available at libraries. If in the pandemic you can get to your library or do pick up and drop off at your library, you might be able to find them there. Some of them are on eBay, and you can find them used for not too much. And some of them I've had to find through estate sales, or when folks in my guild just decided to get rid of some of their stuff or whatever it was. I often pick up some books that way. So the other specific place-based knitting lace book that I have is Knitted Lace of Estonia, which is another lace tradition. And I have Gossamer Webb's A History and Techniques of the Orenburg Lace Shawls. So all these different places have different traditions about their lace, and so it's worth reading like multiple traditions to figure out like that there's not just one story about lace knitting. And anyway, of course, there's not just one story, right? A couple other fun books. One that I've talked to you about before, this is from Annemor Sundbo, Everyday Knitting, where she has the rag pile in her, and she bought this factory and she had a rag pile and she started going through and talking about all the history of all these garments and sweaters that she found, and she tracked them down and looked at the advertisements, and just tons of wonderful stuff in that book. And then this is a new one to me. I just picked it up pretty recently. It's on my pile of things to read, so maybe I'll start here. Who knows? This is called The Old Hand Knitters of the Dales, and it's a reproduction of an older book that came out in the 50s, 51, with an introduction to the early history of knitting. And this is written and illustrated by Marie Hartley and Joan Ingleby. So if any of these are of interest to you, I will put some links over in the show notes, and basically just expect to have a little history of knitting segment on here so that I can have an excuse to read bits and pieces of all these books and tell you what I'm learning. And I'd love to hear what you're learning, and if we'll start a thread over on Ravelry, if you guys have other history books that you can recommend or that you want to talk about with each other, then let's get together and do some knitting history. Yeah. All right. Last segment, giveaway winners. I'm giving away, as I said in the last podcast, some really cool knit crate yarn. This purple is like, it's kind of like my spirit color, I think. I really love it. It has sparkle in it, and it's the Uru yarn by Knit Crate, so somebody's gonna win these two. And then I have these Chaogu. They're very small circumference needles that I tried and didn't quite like, but I think I would love to see someone else use them. So this was all the giveaway stuff. And the giveaway winners are Michelle Lindgren, congratulations, and Olia. So Michelle won for a comment that she put on YouTube, and Olia won from a comment that she put over on the Ravelry thread for the giveaway. So I've sent you both messages. Send me an email at knittingthestash@gmail.com and send me your postal address, and I will get these popped in the post to you. Other than that, I think it's time for me to go knit some more sleeve and read some knitting history. I'm so glad that you guys give me a reason to do this kind of stuff. And I will see you guys back here in a couple of weeks with a huge giveaway. And when I say huge, I mean like voluminous, like a big giveaway from Bad Sheep Yarn. Marcy, I've got an interview with her next weekend, and then we're gonna do a giveaway on the next cast. So stay tuned for episode 83. It'll be worth your waiting while. Yeah, and on that note, I hope you all stay safe and well in the pandemic, and I will see you again in a couple of weeks. Take care.